Hi, I'm Carl Sweeney.
And I'm Raquel Stecher, and this is the CineHistorians podcast, where we explore the history of cinema from across the globe.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the CineHistorians podcast. This is the first episode of season 2. Been a little while since we rounded off season 1, but we're both delighted to be back, I think it's fair to say. So I'm Carl Sweeney, one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined as ever by Raquel Stecher. Hello, Raquel.
Hey, Carl.
Good to be back, isn't it?
I know. I'm so excited. This is a great theme, and I'm just so excited about all of the films that we've chosen, and I think our listeners will really like it.
I think so too. So yeah, for anyone new to the show, each season of CineHistorians is organized around a particular topic. Season 1 was about new waves, and we talked about things like the French New Wave, the British New Wave, New Hollywood, etc. New season, new topic. So this time around, our topic is Sight and Sound magazine's list of the greatest films of all time. The first film to be covered as part of this topic is a film from 1975 directed by Chantal Akerman, which is called Jeanne Dielman, 23 Quai de Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles. Raquel, I know you want to have a go at the French pronunciation of that, don't you?
Yes.
Is this a good time for it?
It is. Jeanne Dielman, 23 Quai de Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles.
Beautifully
I practiced
delivered.
a lot.
So that's the topic. That's the first film, but we need to explain that in a bit more detail. So, yeah, the Sight and Sound list, Raquel. So the British film magazine, Sight and Sound. This was your idea. I thought it was a great idea. So very happy to run with this for season 2. But it's to look at some of the films on the most recent Sight and Sound critics poll of the greatest films of all time. And this was from just a few years ago, 2022. So did you want to say a little bit more, Raquel, about what Sight and Sound magazine is and why we think it's a good idea to look at this list and so on?
Absolutely. And I was working down the Sight and Sound list, just trying to watch the films that I hadn't before when I came up with the idea. So this is a great theme for the podcast. So Sight and Sound is a film magazine published by the BFI, the British Film Institute. The magazine features all sorts of articles, reviews, opinion pieces, interviews, analysis. It's really amazing. Originally, it was a seasonal magazine published 4 times a year, but then in 1990, it merged with the Monthly Film Bulletin and it became a monthly magazine. So back in 1952, Sight and Sound published a top 10 greatest films of all time list. Initially, they posted a director's list, which was polled by the Festival Mondial du Film in Belgium. And those festival organizers had asked over 100 directors what they thought were the greatest films of all time. So in the following issue, Sight and Sound published their own top 10 list. But in this case, they reached out to film critics. They actually sent out a poll to 85 critics from 10 countries. 63 responded, and the list was presented in the autumn issue of the magazine. So fast forward 10 years later, Sight and Sound repeated the process with a new list in 1962, and that one famously had Citizen Kane as the number 1 pick, and that continued for years. The list went on to be published every 10 years, and there was a growing interest in what would make that top 10. And according to Sight and Sound, the individuals polled were asked to interpret what they believed were the greatest films, and to quote them, it was to reflect the film's importance in cinematic history, its aesthetic achievement, or perhaps its personal impact in their own life and their view of cinema. And there's a lot of factors that go into what gets selected, even beyond like personal taste. There's accessibility, not only to the films themselves, but to knowledge about, whether it's books, articles, interviews, documentaries, that add to a greater understanding of the films that are chosen. And you also have to consider changing social attitudes and politics. And our thoughts on cinema have changed over the decades. So it with each list, it's altered. So in 2012, after 6 top 10 lists, Sight and Sound expanded it to 100 films. And they made some changes. Previously, it was 70 to 145 participants, all film critics. And for the 2012 list, they expanded it to include over 800 individuals, film critics, archivists, film historians, academics, etc. And in the 2012 edition, the Sight and Sound list became an even greater point of discussion among cinephiles when Vertigo famously bumped off Citizen Kane for the top spot, which we'll talk about more later. Citizen Kane had been number one from 1962 to 2002. Then in 2022, which is the list we'll be discussing this season, the number of participants doubled. It went from 800 or so to over 1,600. And that ended up having about 4,000 films selected. And they'll have the top 100 selected, but they also added another 150 for an extended list. And to the surprise of many cinephiles, Jeanne Dielman, the film we're talking today, directed by Chantal Akerman, took that number one spot, bumping both Vertigo and Citizen Kane.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on what I said earlier, so this is the topic for the season, but we're not covering every film on that top 100 list. We've selected a few films each. We're going to do 8 episodes. This episode 1 was Raquel's pick, and I think it's a very natural one, of course, because it's the most recent chart topper, as it were. Yeah, I think because it has that kind of constancy, the fact they've run this list every 10 years since 1952, it means it becomes a very interesting snapshot about what films have been seen as important. And I think if you're fascinated by film history, like we are, like presumably everyone listening to us is, you can kind of see how the reputations of some films have ebbed and flowed. You know, there are some films that only appear on one version of the list. There are some films that have been able to maintain a presence. There are films that have like climbed the rankings over a number of different lists and things like that, which is really interesting to me, at least. I think it's a very nice way as well it's kind of like a nice portal to discovering films, because you can kind of argue about every list that comes out, and the idea of quality is always subjective, and there can never be a definitive list of greatest films. But I think something like this, it can be a really useful list, can't it, if you want to kind of broaden your horizons. Like, I think I've seen just over 3/4 of the films on the list, so it definitely leaves me wanting to seek out the other 25% or so.
Right.
Similar for you, I would guess, as well.
Yeah, I'm currently at 65.
Yeah, time will tell. Okay, so at this point, I'll give a quick introduction to the film before Raquel comes back with some background on the director of the film. So Jeanne Dielman, just to say quickly that what happened here in terms of how the film was made was that Chantal Akerman found out about a scheme the Belgian government was running called the Advance on Receipts Production Scheme. She applied to this. She'd written a draft script for the film with a woman called Marilyn Waitler. Originally, the script was called She Sails Towards America. By the time funding came through, Akerman had misgivings about that script, wrote a new script, which became Jeanne Dielman. And she was doing this at the end of 1974. The film is made and released in 1975. Spoiler alert at this stage. And if anyone is considering watching this film, I think definitely worth doing so before listening to our show, if you possibly can. But proceed with caution, basically. So the main character of the film, the title character, is a widowed mother, played by Delphine Seyrig. We watch events from 3 days in the course of Jeanne's life. A lot of this involves domestic tasks like preparing food, and these scenes tend to play out in great detail. It's a very ordinary domestic setting in a lot of ways, but I think one interesting detail is that there's a blue neon light outside, which is flashing continuously into one of the rooms, and it's just a kind of an unsettling detail throughout the whole film. We do also, to be fair, see her outside the home running a few errands and that kind of thing. We see Jeanne interact with her son, who seems to be out of the house during the day but returns later on. And we see that in the afternoons, Jeanne earns money through sex work. So she seems to be visited by a different man each day, at least every day that we see her. And these men are paying her for sex. What you might not get from that description is that all of these things, and I'm sure we'll talk about this further, but all of these things are presented as being part of a very ordered, mundane routine. And without going into too much detail at this stage, when you get to the second half of the film, we start to get a few clues partway through the second day that Jeanne now seems a bit out of sorts. And I'll probably just leave it there for now, Raquel. We'll discuss some of the details later. Unless there's anything else you want to add about the synopsis before we go on to talk about Chantal Akerman.
No, that was perfect because we're going to go into a lot more detail in the episode. So I wanted to give a little background on Chantal Akerman. She was born in Belgium in 1950. She didn't have much interest in films until at the age of 15, she watched Pierrot Le Fou, the French New Wave film by Jean-Luc Godard, which was very experimental. It played with conventions. I could definitely see how it inspired her. So after watching that, she enrolled in Belgian film school, began experimenting with filmmaking in her late teens. Her early work is very minimalist, made on small budgets. Often she stars herself as the lead. In 1971, she released Saute ma vie, or Blow Up My Town, which is a short film that kind of lays the groundwork for Jeanne Dielman later on. Another film, La Chambre, featured shots of her in a hotel room. And then later she made her first documentary and feature-length film, Hotel Monterey, which is also set in a hotel. And she developed this style of like this static, minimalist shots that were framed very beautifully and they linger on that subject matter. She went on to make Je tu il elle, a three-part story starring herself. And with Hotel Monterey and Je tu il elle, people really started to notice this like up and coming filmmaker. And she had already accomplished a lot by the age of 24. So Akerman had a distinctive like visual style and film language. She was very methodical in her approach, embracing this idea of slow cinema. She's considered one of the first people to really embrace that. Um, and in this, like she was really adamant about audiences becoming aware of the passage of time. So a lot of things are slow and methodical and linger. Her fixed shots almost reminiscent of like Yasujiro Ozu, because they are very like set and you see like either a room or a hallway, and they linger much longer than you would expect. It creates this intimacy with the viewer, and exposes this like vulnerability that almost becomes uncomfortable. It's kind of a trademark of her work. And especially in Akerman's early work, her films were not plot driven. They're much more about the experience and the story structure. And she wrote much of her own scripts, and a lot of them were heavily inspired by either her own personal experiences or by story of her mother. Um, at the age of 25, which is quite incredible. It's also on the same level as like Orson Welles with Citizen Kane. He was around the same age. She released her best known work, Jeanne Dielman, which we're talking about today. And the film starred at Cannes Film Festival. It got a mixed reception. People were already walking out of the theater before they even made it to like the end of the 3.5 hour running time. And there was some pushback from the media. It was labeled like an unapproachable feminist film. However, it was also equally embraced too, because the day after the Cannes premiere, Akerman was flooded with requests from other film festivals who wanted to screen her film. So, like after Jeanne Dielman, she experimented with genres and formats. She made documentaries, more feature films, television segments and series. News from Home from 1976 features like shots of New York City with Chantal Akerman reading letters sent to her from her mother back in Belgium. She made this very voyeuristic film called Toute une nuit, and the semi-biographical Les Rendezvous d'Anna and La Captive, based on a Proust novel. And she worked pretty much throughout her whole life. She worked on limited budgets, great production constraints, and she spent much of her career taking odd jobs, experimenting with different formats and genres, even making behind the scenes documentaries to help get her further funding for her projects. She made a musical called Golden 80s, and she made a behind the scenes documentary so that she could keep filming that one. So for many years, there was limited access to her work, and she worked with curators to restore and increase access to her own films, which ended up leading to a greater appreciation of her work because it was more accessible. And her last film was No Home Movie, which is a meditative documentary that depicts like conversations between her and her ailing mother, but also kind of examines like isolation and technology. And she passed away in 2015, just after that film. I think the film was still being edited when she passed away.
Yeah, and that's a really good introduction, I think, to her. It's so interesting to think back to that Cannes screening of Jeanne Dielman because, yeah, I think Ackerman talked about being able to hear the chairs flip up as people were leaving
Yes.
the
And the
cinema.
Cannes audience, they're known for booing and walking out and also very long, applauses. So they're picky.
Yeah, it's an interesting place to debut a film for sure. So what do we know, Raquel, about the history of this film? Like we say, the Sight and Sound list obviously predates Jeanne Dielman, which was released in
Yeah.
1975. Exactly when did this film get onto the list, and what's the history been there?
Yeah. So as I said before, it caused like quite a stir when it made that number one spot on the 2022 list. People were shocked because it's a 3.5 hour avant-garde film, isn't plot driven. Even among cinephiles, it's polarizing. So for it to move to the number one spot, knocking off both Vertigo and Citizen Kane was quite shocking. But it also just had a lot of support amongst like the individuals who voted. I like what my friend, critic Mariah Gates had to say. She said that expanding the vote did exactly what it was supposed to do, bring in the voices that haven't had a seat at the table. So the list goes from 800 individuals to 1,600 individuals who are voting. So with that increase in votes, you had an increase of people who were really championing Jeanne Dielman. So just a little history about it on the list. It first appeared in 2012 at the tied for the 36th spot. In fact, Jeanne Dielman, along with Claire Denis Beautrevet from 1998, were the only two women film directed films to make that list and to make the list in the whole history. So it had all been male directors before 2012, and then you have these two women directed films in 2012. And now fast forward to the 2022 list, and it changes quite dramatically. The top 100 films consist of 76 total filmmakers, 67 men and 9 women. And to break that down differently, out of 100 films, 89 of them are directed by men and 11 directed by women. So the films that were added to the 2022 list include The News from Home, which I had mentioned earlier, which is tied for the 52nd place. Akerman and Agnes Varda are actually the only two women directors who have multiple films on the list. Varda had The Gleaners and I, which is like maybe one of the only documentaries on that list. And then Cleo from 5 to 7, which we talked about in the first season of CineHistorians. So if you want to listen to that, I highly recommend it. And then other films were like Barbara Loden's Wanda, Jane Campion's The Piano, Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and on. And Claire Denis Beautrevet actually went from number 78 back up to number 7. So it really shows the increased appreciation for women-directed films and how things have changed with such an increase, like really expanding the vote and including more voices.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to segue into our general discussion of the film. But I wanted to start with some thoughts on the list. I think you've set that up for us very nicely. Like you say, it was a big shake-up. The first time a film directed by a woman is top of the list. The first time a film from the 1970s is top of the list. The first time since 1952 that it's a film that's not in the English language at the top of the list,
Oh,
and
good.
so on. But um, I'm quite a fan of the 2022 list. I know it was controversial, but I think alongside a big shakeup, you also had a lot of continuity. Vertigo
Yeah.
and Citizen Kane are still there in the top three. Someone like Hitchcock is still very well represented, or someone like Billy Wilder, for example. Still quite a lot of films from the classic Hollywood era. So it's not a complete overhaul. There's continuity
No.
there.
Yes.
Um,
Battleship
you get you,
Potemkin and The Rules of the Game are on the list like they are usually.
yeah, and then you have that interesting discussion around. Some people were still questioning. This is not diverse enough. There's a lack of films from Latin America, for example.
Right.
And then you get sort of the people coming from a completely different perspective who are now thinking it's too diverse. And there's always this kind of debate. And like we said, this is an interesting snapshot. So it's a focal point for those debates. I suppose an interesting area to explore this film is there was definitely a lot of discussion about whether the fact this film was now top of that list was a it was a shift towards a more highbrow list, you could argue, because movies like Vertigo or Citizen Kane, although they're kind of unusual examples of mainstream American filmmaking, they were still kind of part of that mainstream system. Whereas this is a
Right.
completely different style of film, isn't it, Raquel? So yeah, I guess how do you feel? Does this film being top of the list show that it's now too highbrow, too elitist as a list, or not? How do you feel about this film being the number one?
Yeah, I mean, I love this movie and I feel very strongly that it deserves a spot up in at least the top 10. I don't know if I put it at number 1, but I definitely put it in the top 10. And I think it shows that we're like our idea of cinema is changing with like I had mentioned, like it changes with every decade as seen on the list, but also like what is cinema? Is it a plot driven movie that has movie stars? It's an hour and a half to 2 hours long. It's got action, it's got romance. Like, is that cinema or is cinema greater than that? And I think that this goes to show that there is a lot of variety because you see there's shorts on the list as well. There's documentaries, there's films from all different countries. But it does, I see the argument where a film like Citizen Kane or Vertigo or even Tokyo Story, they are very powerful storytelling tools to deliver this really interesting message in a visually interesting way. And Jeanne Dielman doesn't really tell a story per se, but it shows a story over a long period of time, and it's not as approachable as the other films. So it does, I don't know. I can see why it's a controversial pick, but
Yeah,
I think it's worthy of a spot high up the list.
yeah, I think so too. I think it's a very interesting film. I think with that list, if someone who had never seen a film or was just getting into films was given that list, there is a lot of very accessible stuff on there. They had movies
Yeah.
like Get Out on there, or
Parasite is a
Casablanca,
huge hit.
Goodfellas,
Yeah.
yeah, The Godfather, Singing in the Rain. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't buy the idea. I don't agree that the list itself is too elitist or inaccessible or highbrow. But I think the top of the list is naturally what people are drawn to, and that is a
Right.
bit of a shift.
Yeah.
I was quite struck by a quote. I was reading the BFI film classic book about Jeanne Dielman by Catherine Fowler, and she says something in there which is worth picking up on. To declare Jeanne Dielman a classic is to difference the film canon. So just the idea that it's a
Oh,
very different kind of film that people might not be accustomed to. And in a number of ways, isn't it? Like it's partly about the style of filming, I think. It's visually a very different film to what you would expect from a mainstream style of filmmaking. So, it's you could call it almost kind of a flat style of filming. There are no close-ups, there are no POV shots that show us this
right.
woman's perspective. The camera doesn't move. The character is actually very inscrutable most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that? What I think it means is that any slight deviations there actually then jump out as being quite important. So even something as simple as the character smiling sort of makes you pause because it's actually a departure from most of the film where she's very impassive, isn't it?
No, and I think that's the power of the movie is that like it's slow, it's purposeful, but it's subtle. And I think it goes to what Chantal Akerman has said in like many interviews that she really wanted audiences to feel every minute of her movies. She didn't want somebody to watch her film and just say, oh, those 2 hours just passed by really quickly. And in the case of Jeanne Dielman, she didn't want somebody to just be like, oh, I just lost 3.5 hours of my life. On the contrary, she wanted you to be aware of time passing. There's a really good quote by Ackerman. She says, often when people come out of a good film, they would say that time flew without them noticing. What I want is to make people feel the passing of time. So I don't take 2 hours from their lives, they experience them. And this is what I think is really powerful because when those subtle things happen, they become much more um, potent because it lingers. It's those subtle, like you're trying to pick up on anything that's happening. So those small moments end up being big moments because those are the things that are happening along the story. And like you can tell in the first half, these small things are happening and then everything starts to go awry. And I just think like there are a few memorable scenes, but that might be the point. This is not a quick action driven, like dialogue driven movie, but it makes an impact because you don't have to go back into your memory to revisit it, or you don't even have to rewatch it. Like you've actually experienced it in real time. And I think that's what makes this movie radical is like today you have like vertical video content on social media, TikTok and reels and stuff like that. And there's lots of cuts and special effects in films, but this is like the total opposite of that. It's like a powerful film. It exposes sort of like the woman's role in like a patriarchal society. And it's like this rebellion against like what we consider to be a film or entertainment. And also it just has that longevity because we are like in the online space right now, everyone's talking about being either childless or single, or they're talking about being a trad wife. And in this, like, this is actually very relevant because she doesn't want to remarry after widowhood. She wants to remain single, but she is also living that sort of traditional wife role, even without the husband. So people can sort of like, even today, looking back at a film from 50 years ago, still find a lot to relate to.
Yeah, and so I suppose it's partly about, like we said, the visual style,
Yeah.
not using devices like close-ups and so on,
Mhm.
and then it's what it's using. So the visual style that she's chosen, and she's chosen it to show unusual actions. So it takes a woman who's a domestic woman. It shows her doing things that are very rarely the focal point in films, and
Yes.
not only does it show those things, it does so in great detail. I think it's fair to say. So
Yeah.
long scenes in the film of quite mundane, normal actions.
And that's what I think is extraordinary about this movie is that Ackerman is taking something that's like not thought about. It's taken for granted, like the life of a housewife, and she elevates it to like an art form because it's this like ordinary woman in sort of an extraordinary circumstance. And the fact that she's widowed and she's a sex worker, and then that like very violent ending. And like the domestic space isn't really something that's like front and center in cinema. It's in the background. It's sort of like woven into a story, but here it's like front and center.
Yeah.
And I just think that's interesting that Chantal Akerman can like take like the mundane and make it like high art. And I had to say, there's one scene in particular which I think shows like the power of Ackerman's filmmaking style, Delphine Seyrig's performance, but then also something that mirrored myself that I actually was taken aback when I saw it. It's when everything's unraveling and she goes to her like food storage and she looks for potatoes. So she takes the bag of potatoes and there's a singular potato left and it's not enough for dinner. So she's got this super strict routine. Every single minute of her day is taken up with some task. And this disrupts that flow. She has to go to the market to buy a bag of potatoes. And there's this great shot of Delphine Seyrig in the elevator, clutching the bag of potatoes, looking up, waiting for the elevator to take her up to her floor. And she looks dejected. She looks like very sad. And the framing of that is beautiful because you just get a little strip from the elevator, the open elevator, and you see her and she's looking up in the distance. And it's like a work of art. And it's such a small storyline, but that happens to me all the time where I forget a crucial ingredient for dinner and I only notice it at the last minute or I ran out of something. And for me, like, even though it's a small thing, it always feels like a failure. And I always punish myself for going out and getting that thing immediately, even when it disrupts my day. And I was like, wow, that is reflected in this movie, in that one small scene, and done so in such a visually stunning way that it's art. And I don't know, I felt very seen, like somebody just held like a mirror up to me.
Yeah, well, there's actually a good Ackerman quote which I think speaks to that because she said, "With a woman doing the washing up, I almost spoke of humanity," which I
Mm,
think tracks quite well
yeah,
with what you're saying. I think the casting of Delphine Seyrig is quite important to that. And again,
yeah,
Ackerman had said that if we saw someone making beds and doing dishes who we normally saw doing those things, we wouldn't really see that person. So it had to be someone we didn't normally see doing dishes. So um, the two women had
good point.
met at a film festival a couple of years earlier. Seyrig had an image as kind of a beautiful, graceful actress, but she was also very interested in feminism. So she seems like very apt casting. You know, she had, like I say, a pre-existing image that served the purposes of the movie, and she was also very interested in sort of shaking things up. And
Yeah.
during the filming, apparently they both became very friendly. They would both often eat breakfast together at a local cafe. And Seyrig found filming Jeanne Dielman to be an experience worth treasuring, in her words. So I think it's very smart casting,
I
basically.
agree. Yeah.
Um, like we said earlier, I think we touched on this earlier. Filming um, the script is being written at the end of 1974. The film is filmed in early 1975. It's a very quick turnaround, actually, because filming begins at the end of January. It's ready for its first ever screening in May. One thing I found interesting as I was reading about the film is that it wasn't shot in chronological order, which on one level is not that unusual because most films aren't shot in chronological order. But it's such a linear film that you wonder if maybe this was a different story. But no, it's the order of the shooting was dictated by the camera angles and the lighting setups. So all the wide angle shots through the kitchen doorway done in one go. The lighting
Mhm.
adjusted just to adjust for the time of day. Um,
Yeah, and I saw
what
this
I
little documentary that had behind the scenes footage of the making of this, and it's Delphine Seyrig with like the script, and she is talking to Chantal Akerman about how she's leaving a room and entering a room. So there was a lot of like dialogue back and forth of like what was the intent, how do I do that? So even though it was filmed out of order, it seems like there was a lot of intention too. And I know that they also had different approaches. Like Delphine Seyrig was very like, okay, this has to have a meaning and a purpose. And Chantal Akerman was very much, it is what it is, you know? So
yeah
the fact that they could work together with those two different styles, I think made it really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because like Ackerman, kind of like you're saying, she didn't want to explain things too much. She didn't want to
Yeah.
explain this woman too much to the audience, and that's part of the interest in the film, I think. And especially on rewatch, you almost want to explain things more than you're able to because you're just not given all the context in the film itself.
Yeah.
I was wondering what it must have been like to watch this film in 1975. Like you said, we kind of get a mixed sense, don't we? Because we hear about all those walkouts at the Cannes Film Festival. Like you also said earlier, the following day, Ackerman gets all these requests to show the film at other festivals. So immediately a mixed reaction. To bring it back to Science Sound, when this film topped the list, Laura Mulvey wrote a nice piece about Jeanne Dielman for the magazine. And she said that back in 1975, it stood out as something completely new and unexpected. So I think it must have been interesting to experience this as something very different.
Yeah.
And Mulvey says, one might say that it felt as though there was a before and an after Jeanne Dielman. So it's kind of like what it would have been like to see it for the first time at the time, and also what it must be like to have peaked potentially at quite an early age. Because Ackerman said, at the age of 25, I was given to understand that I was a great filmmaker. It was pleasing, of course, but also troubling because I wondered how I could do better. And I don't
Right.
know if I have. So maybe, again, like you said earlier, there's the Orson Welles comparison of like almost overly succeeding too early. And how
Right.
do you top that? It must be a strange feeling to grapple with for a filmmaker, I guess, right?
I know that has a huge effect on artists of all kinds of like when you peak too early, like what's after. Some people stop working, some people can't even achieve any more greatness. And then there are people like Orson Welles or Chantal Akerman that keep going. They're just so driven by their passion that even when things get there's lack of funding or things don't happen the way they want to, they still keep going.
Yeah. And I was interested with what you were saying earlier about the relevance of this film
Yeah.
now. And I was wondering about, like, is it actually easier to watch a film like this now? Because again, to take it back to that Laura Mulvey magazine article, she said that when she was first screening this film to students in the early 1980s, there were always students, sometimes lots of students, who had to leave the screening, had to go and smoke, had to go take a
Yeah.
break or whatever. And that she said that over a period of time, maybe 20 years later, actually these students would sit there and be gripped by the film. They would actually experience it properly. So maybe it's about the idea of slow cinema catching on, like you said earlier, that Akerman's kind of a precursor to something that became much, much bigger later. I mean, in terms of mainstream viewers and mainstream cinema, I still think most people would find this a very challenging film to watch.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the length of the film, because you can get films these that, in recent years, a very long film like Oppenheimer or something. There are long films that can pack out audiences, but it's the style of the film that I think most people would still experience as challenging or confrontational, right? Like I knew I wouldn't be able to convince my wife to watch this film, for example.
I mean, our attention spans are destroyed by a lot of this like short form content and just being exposed to all of this stimuli, that just sitting there for 3.5 hours for a movie where not a lot of things happen. There's not action. Like Oppenheimer moves along. There's so much happening, and there's all sorts of like visual styles in that. There's a really interesting story. It's an explosive movie, literally. But yeah, so I can see how that goes by. But this one, Akerman wanted you to feel those 3.5 hours, and it does. And I remember when I first watched this, I watched it at home, but I put my phone in the other room. I'm like, I'm going to experience this. I know that this is a movie that I just can't start and pause and go. I think I took one bathroom break, and that's it. I watched the whole way through, and that's very difficult. That's very difficult when you have all these distractions. Easier in the theater when you're kind of forced to sit there, but at home it is. So I can see with our terrible attention spans how this could be work to experience. Yeah.
We should probably go for a break in a second, but just a couple of things I wanted to very quickly mention before we move on. This film is often talked about as being made by like an all-women team, and it's not quite true. Some members of the crew were men. There was a male art director, for example, an assistant art director as well, a sound editor and a sound mixer. So heavily, predominantly made by women, but not entirely. Also, there's some interesting discussion around whether Akerman, very influenced by her mother, like you said, but also she spent a lot of time as a child with her aunts, who were maybe more like Jeanne Dielman than her mother was in some ways, because I think her mother worked, whereas her aunts were more domestic. So maybe just worth flagging up. Was there anything else here you wanted to say, Raquel, before we take a quick break?
No, we have a lot more to talk about on the other side.
I think we do, because we've danced very effectively around some of the most interesting developments in the film, specifically one near the very end. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll come back to talk a bit more about Jeanne Dielman. Okay, everybody, welcome back. We are still talking about Jeanne Dielman. And what we normally do, for anyone new to the podcast, if this is your first episode, we usually break down some key moments from the film in question. We normally pick a couple each. I'm actually going to break format here a little bit because of the nature of the movie, I think. So my key moment is the lack of key moments. And I think we kind of touched on this already, but it's a film that shows you relatively, unremarkable things, and it really draws out those actions. So there are some definite exceptions, and Raquel's going to talk about some, especially a big one at the end. But in a way, I think it's more about the accumulation of detail than it is about the kind of standout moments we normally pick out. Because, again, to take it back to the style of filming, it's quite an inexpressive approach. So we can't really highlight a particular close-up or a standout camera move and things like that in the way we normally might. Instead, you have to be kind of alert watching this film to the subtle distinctions. And I think possibly a first-time viewer might miss a lot of them because you kind of almost get into a bit of a trance watching the movie. if you're paying close attention, you notice in the second half of the film that Jeanne seems kind of out of sorts. She comes out of the bedroom on day 2. She's seen a client. She seems a bit disoriented. And you start to notice little things like her forgetting to turn on the light or forgetting about what's on the stove. And this continues into the third day. I think one example that would probably stand out is when she's polishing the shoes. If you compare the scene there with the earlier example of her doing that, she's doing it in a bit of a different way. She's a bit less precise. I think she drops the brush. So it doesn't sound like much. The standout moment is she drops a brush or whatever, but it's kind of the point. A lot of these moments on their own are not obvious standouts, but if you put them all together, they're quite meaningful and they are building to something. And I know you're going to talk about that, Raquel, but not quite yet. There was something else you wanted to highlight beforehand, I think, right?
Yeah, and I have to say, I think maybe it's my approach and my perspective, but I actually think those moments stand out to me because for me personally, chores is just like an endless cycle of torture. That's just my thought. Some people enjoy it, I do not. So I was very focused on the shoe shining, the polishing of the actually I want to say the shoe shining I think is a reference to Saute Ma Vie, because in that short film there's a really erratic scene where Chantal Akerman is shining her shoes and then putting the polish on her legs as well and polishing her legs. It's a very chaotic movie. But even the scenes where like she's massaging the ground beef a little too much, I was like, that's going to be a very tough meatloaf. Or like she's polishing the silverware and she drops a knife. In the potato sequence that I mentioned earlier, that to me kind of stands out just because to me those are just like, if I had a day like that, I might lose it at the end. I might not do what she did, but I might go mad a little bit.
Yeah. So did you want to talk about, because there's a character of the son who I very briefly mentioned.
Yes.
Did you want to highlight the fact that there's an interesting conversation between the two of them?
I think so. There are two bedtime chats between those two characters. And I think this is where we actually learn the most about Jeanne Dielman. In fact, this is actually the only really two conversations in the movie. We get little bits of dialogue. She has a conversation with the lady who drops off her baby, but otherwise there's not much in terms of conversation. So this is really where we get to know Jeanne Dielman. So they have their, Jeanne and her son Sylvain have this routine. Like Jeanne sees her client in the afternoon. After they leave, that's when her son comes home. She makes some dinner. They eat dinner at the table. She pulls out there's a pull-out couch and she makes his bed. And so we see this routine at least twice. And like the bedtime chats are really interesting because on the first night, she makes a remark to her son, "Oh, you're always reading books just like your father." And then the son is like, "Can you tell me about how you met my father?" So that's when we learn about George, the dead husband, and we learn crucial aspects about Jean's personal viewpoints and her approach to life. So she met him during the liberation of Brussels in 1944 at the end of World War II, and she noticed him throwing chewing gum and chocolates to like the civilians. And I think it's interesting because like he's actually already providing for her, and that is how he functions in her life. He's just like the provider. So then she's introduced to him through a friend, and she notes that she was making horrible pay as a billing clerk, but he had a successful business, and her aunts were like encouraging her to marry him. And we learn that Jean's parents died in the war and that she's living with her aunts, which is exactly what happened to Chantal Akerman's mom. Like her mom's parents, her grandparents, died in concentration camps, and she was left to be raised by her aunts. So that's very biographical. And then we learn that George's business goes under, and the aunts change their mind. They're like, "You could do better. You're young. You're pretty." But she marries him anyway. And it's not because she loves him or even wants to get married. She says that she didn't want to get married. She wasn't interested in marriage. She wanted a home and a child. And she knew that the way to get that was to marry the guy. And she was just like, marrying him was the thing to do and the pathway to get what she wanted. And so the son asks her, like, would you remarry again? And she's like, no, get used to somebody else. And that explains why she has the clients. The clients, provide her the income that she needs to run her household and take care of her son. But she's not interested in having them around permanently. They're just, an hour, every night or something. So there's a great line because the son asks, like, the son says, like, if I were a woman, I could never make love with somebody I wasn't deeply in love with. And she's like, how could you know you're not a woman? And I think this is my favorite line in the movie because in what you can interpret the son's role as symbolic of maybe the male audience viewing the movie, and if you do it that way, it kind of holds more power. Like, maybe a man would not understand this perspective, but maybe a woman could. And I just thought that was like maybe an interesting observation. And in the second chat, it actually gets a lot more intimate and a little sort of like Oedipus complex-ish, where the son is actually bringing up the particulars of sex and pleasure and orgasms and the possibility of a man inflicting pain on a woman during the act. And he goes on to discuss this perspective, and it's a very awkward exchange. And her response was like, because he says, like, once he found out about sex, he did not want his dad touching his mom because he was horrified by what was happening. And she's like, you needn't have worried because there's no point talking about these things. And I think that sets us up for the end quite nicely because it foreshadows what's to come, which is, to me, the most important part of the movie is the ending. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So the climax of the story is Jeanne Dielman's climax, which culminates after everything seems to go wrong in the movie. Like you were talking before, there's like this series of mishaps, like, she forgets to put the lid on the tureen after she deposits the money. She forgets to button the button on her house coat, the potato incident I had mentioned earlier. So at the end, after all of these mishaps, she's in her room having prepared it for her next client. And she has this package that she's struggling to open. And it's got like a nightgown inside. And then she goes to her kitchen to grab a pair of scissors. And the presence of the scissors in the bedroom, because she leaves it behind and doesn't bring it back to the kitchen after she's done, it becomes like the catalyst for like this violent final act. So she receives the client, they have sex on her bed, and then this time it's different from the other clients because she actually starts to feel pleasure. You can see her face change, and you can see she's confused and frustrated, but she's also enjoying it. She tries to push the guy off. She's grabbing onto the duvet. And then this completely throws her off because it's not part of the status quo. It's not part of her routine. There's this expectation that she fulfills a service for the client pays her. This completely throws that off. So there's this great shot of Delphine Seyrig at the vanity, and there's the mirror in front of her. And in the reflection, you can see like the client in like a state of repose. And then she's just buttoning up her blouse, and she sees the scissors that she left on the vanity table. She grabs them and out of nowhere goes up and stabs the guy in the neck. And then this is the part I actually love the most about this, because it does seem to come out of nowhere, but then you also kind of can't blame her for going mad because it all builds up, like all the pressure and the tension builds up over time. You get this last shot, which I think is really interesting. It's her sitting at her dining room table, sort of in the dark. She's got blood on her hands, on her blouse, and she's kind of like looking off in the distance, and her face is starting to show all these different emotions. And that scene is 4 minutes long. And we just kind of sit with her quietly at the table, processing just what happened. And I think this is like indicative of Akerman's style because she wanted audiences to feel every moment. So like in another movie, it could have just ended quickly after the murder, or it could have been a shortened scene, like where she's at the table looking off in the distance, covered in blood, the camera kind of pans away and done. But instead, you're sitting there with her, processing what happened, you're both in your feelings, like what's the future going to hold. And because it lasts 4 minutes, you're there a long time. Because in other films, if there's like a shocking ending or maybe you're really sad, I find myself sometimes crying through the credits. The lights go on in the theater. I feel very exposed, or I'm thinking it after I left the theater, or my jaw's on the floor. Like it's usually something that you experience after the movie. Akerman gives you those 4 minutes to process what's happening.
Yeah, I think she clearly felt that that scene of Jeanne sitting after having killed the man was very important, because she was
Yeah.
asked at one point, why did you end your movie with a murder? And she said it didn't end with a murder, which is a way of saying that actually there are several minutes after that, like you said, which are important. And actually, there's she had kind of taken the final scene of the movie and screened it in isolation in 2001 at the
Oh.
Venice Biennale, and retitled it "Woman Sitting After Killing." So, very curious choice. And I think if that meant that some people found out about the way this movie ended without having sat through the first 3 hours and 10 minutes, I think that would be a shame, because this movie becomes completely different on a second watch to the first viewing. Because
Yes.
if you watch it first, this is why I wanted to be very vague in the synopsis earlier, is if you watch this film and have no idea what's coming, I think you can be completely blindsided by that development. And then the second viewing, you're kind of looking for the clues, even though Akerman is not trying to explain. So
Yeah.
I read an interview with her from 1976 where she says, I don't try to explain. I'm not being psychological. Why is she like that? Or in this case, it might be more like, we're asking, why did she do that?
Mm-hmm.
But she said, I do use each element in the film to show clearly why she is like she is. The way she wears her clothes, the way the apartment appears, it's all referential. I just use the principal things. But she doesn't want to give you a simplistic explanation for any of these things. But even if she's not giving you that, you still kind of want to try and
Yeah.
have some kind of explanation for it. You can't get rid of that impulse to explain things, I think.
Yeah.
So I
It's
do think
human
it's a
nature.
fascinating, yeah, I think it's a fascinating development near the end of the film. I'm going to come back to that in the next section shortly. So yeah, those are some of our key moments, or non-key moments in my case. The other thing we do on this podcast for any first-time viewers and listeners is we do a section called Any Other Business, where we just have a nice opportunity here to talk about anything else about this film or linked to this film that interests us. And we'll start here with you, Raquel. I know you wanted to talk about some of the critics who chose this film for that Sight and Sound poll that we've been talking about on this episode.
Yes. So with the individual ballots, those are actually available on the Sight and Sound website. So you can read through what individual voters voted for. And some of them have commentary, and those are really interesting to read. So I just kind of wanted to share a few quotes from those, from the voters who voted for Jeanne Dielman. The first is from Thomas Lafley, the film critic, a good friend of mine too. And an understated pressure cooker thriller concealed in the mundanity of an everyday woman's routine with the hypnotizing precision of a metronome. And I love that because it does. It's like that last half, the pressure builds and builds and builds as things keep mounting and going wrong. And I agree, like all those motions that she's going through in her daily routine, it is like a metronome. It's just all it, and it is hypnotizing. So I thought that was just perfect. So the next one is from Cameron Bailey, the CEO of the Toronto International Film Festival. And he writes, quiet, remorseless, and somehow more relevant with every passing year, which I think speaks to the longevity of this film, that it still keeps its relevancy with audiences, even as generations come. Then the next one is from Professor Barbara Creed, a groundbreaking cinematic achievement in which Akerman creates a unique filmic language to explore the way in which the daily life of a single mother is regulated by space, time, and routine, and the horror that erupts when her sense of order is fractured. I really love that quote. And then the last one is from Professor Jocelyn Sapaniak-Gilles, and she writes, no other film has ever captured how the personal is political, formally, sonically, visually, as rapturously as Jeanne Dielman It is a masterpiece of cold feminist rage. And I love those last three words, cold feminist rage, because I feel like that's what this film is.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. I wanted to highlight a recent Sight and Sound article. It's from the summer 2025 issue. So, very topical to when we're recording this. Obviously, viewers might be coming to us later. They have an article in there called 1975, the year that changed cinema forever. And it's got a subheading From Jaws to Jeanne Dielman. So, kind of a nice little coincidence because Jaws obviously being our last episode of season one,
yes,
Jeanne Dielman being our first episode of season two. So I liked that. And then in the introduction to the piece that Adam Nayman wrote, he kind of teased this up. So he's talking about 1975 as kind of an inflection point. So in the Hollywood context, which is kind of what he says there, it's like you have kind of a more independent approach starting in the late 60s. We kind of talked about some of this on the New Hollywood episode last season, I think. And then 75 is kind of the midpoint before you get into the more corporate culture in American cinema of the 80s. Mm-hmm. So partly it's about mainstream cinema, Hollywood cinema, but actually it chimes quite well with what Laura Mulvey wrote in that article about Jeanne Dielman for Sight and Sound in 2022, because she said 1975 was a remarkable year for experimental cinema because it kind of veers between an actual avant-garde and an extreme art cinema. So this idea of 1975 as kind of a moment of change or an inflection point is really interesting. To take it back to Adam Nayman, I like the comparison or the contrast between Jaws and Jeanne Dielman, because he says, between those two films, all the rest of cinema sits. So we have that idea of them being at complete opposite sides of the spectrum of cinema, completely, representing completely different kinds of cinema, which I think is a natural thing to say. But then he also tries to compare the films and says, it'd be cute maybe to propose Jaws and Jeanne as secret sharers, separate but equal exercises in suspense cinema, engineering under the sign of Hitchcock. And I liked it when I came across that quote, because when I was recently rewatching Jeanne Dielman, I also found myself thinking a little bit about Hitchcock, because I think there are one or two areas of comparison between this film and Psycho. And anyone who knows me knows that Psycho is one of my favorite films. But one thing I would highlight is that they both have quite inscrutable female protagonists. So if you watch Psycho, it's actually impossible to pinpoint the moment when Marion Crane decides to steal the money. Hitchcock doesn't explain that to you. Similarly, I couldn't tell you exactly here, when the first thought about committing a murder comes into Jeanne's mind. We don't get that kind of psychological explanation. The other comparison, I think, is there's a Hitchcock quote about Psycho where he said he really increased the shock of the shower scene murder by boring the audience first. And I think he's kind of exaggerating. I don't think it's quite true, but there is a kind of minimalism in the first 40 minutes or so of Psycho, because she steals some money, and then it's quite low-key stuff. She falls asleep by the side of the road. She wants to buy a new car. Things don't erupt into big earth-shattering events until later with the murder. And then Jeanne Dielman is kind of the ultimate example of that. This is the ultimate example of a film deliberately trying to bore the audience or to put you into kind of a hypnotic state.
Yeah.
And that makes that shocking scene at the end much more shocking and much more impactful. So I like the idea of there being almost a kind of Hitchcockian thing here with Jeanne Dielman. I like the idea of, at first glance, you wouldn't compare this to Jaws, but actually maybe there's something there that we can compare.
That article was also talking about how films of that year ended with like sudden acts of violence, like I think it had mentioned Dog Day Afternoon in Nashville. And I was like, Jeanne Dielman fits in that too. It has that sudden act of violence at the end.
Yeah. And like we've already said, that sudden act of violence, meaning that you then, like with Psycho, you go back to watch again and you rewatch it in a completely different way once you know what's coming across. Okay, I think we're both going to round off with a recommendation or two. So Raquel, why don't you give us your recommendations first?
Yes, so I wanted to recommend a few films that are about domestic labor, which I think would be good companions to Jeanne Dielman if you wanted to keep exploring that theme. So the first one is Black Girl from 1966. It's directed by Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembène, and it's on the Sight and Sound list. It's tied for the 95th place. So it tells the story of this young woman in Dakar who is hired by this white French couple to work as a nanny. And they move back to the south of France. They take her with them. And the wife becomes very controlling of the young woman. The young woman is faced with like criticism. She's sexualized. Like all of these new responsibilities are like thrown at her. She has a very demanding boss, and as things grow more tense, the young woman's life starts to unravel, kind of like with Jeanne Dielman. And the film is an excellent watch, but it also taps into like a larger theme of colonialism and exploitation. It's quite good. I highly recommend you guys watch it. And just a few other films. There is the film Tully starring Charlize Theron, and she plays a mother who just had her third baby. She's completely exhausted by all the demands of like raising a family. She also has to take care of a son who has a behavioral disorder. So in the story, she's gifted a night nanny who helps relieve her of some of the burden. But as the film goes on, we learn that not everything is as it seems, and it's got this kind of wonderful twist. Yeah, I don't want to ruin the ending, but it's very good. So then another one, a classic, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers from 1954, the Stanley Donen MGM musical. Jane Powell plays this young woman who marries this backwoodsman, played by Howard Keel. And she's chosen because she's like strong and hardy, and she embraces the challenge of living in the backwoods. But she's surprised when she's taken home by her new husband that he also expects her to care for his 7 adult brothers. So that's a good one. And then if Jeanne Dielman is too long for you, I recommend this short film, which is only 11 minutes long. It's called My Wonderful Life. It's a Singaporean animated short directed by Colleen Koh, who is an animator. And so it follows this woman who is a personal assistant by day, and then at home she's overwhelmed by the demands of her 2 children, and then she receives no help from her lazy husband. So at one point, she's so run down of having to take care of everybody that she gets sick and she's hospitalized. And at the hospital, she's the one being taken care of, and she likes it. And when it's time for her to go back home, she doesn't want to, and she starts to self-destruct. And this movie is so funny and dark. It's really well done. It's currently on the film festival circuit, so it's not currently available just to watch online. But if you do end up either seeing this at a festival, or you might catch it later once it's available, it's well worth it. I highly recommend it. And if for any reason you're interested in any of those or any of the films that we discussed, I just wanted to remind people that we have a Letterboxd account, letterboxd.com/CineHistorians. And everything we mention in each episode is on a dedicated list. So if there's anything that we talked about, you can catch it there.
Yeah, that's great. And kudos, Raquel. I think that must be the first time someone's compared Jeanne Dielman and Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. I'd be shocked if it wasn't. So I think that's really good. I'm only going to recommend one film, but it's another Chantal Akerman film, which I think makes a nice little companion piece with this movie. So the film I want to talk about is from 1974, and it's Je tu il elle. This was shown in festivals before Jeanne Dielman, but then not seen a bit more widely until later on. It's a movie with quite a simple 3-part structure. So the first third of the film shows a young woman called Julie, who's played by Chantal Akerman herself. She's living in a fairly cramped domestic space. So we see her writing and memorably eating sugar straight from the bag as well.
My favorite part.
Yeah. So the first third of the film, we're solely watching her in her place. And then in the middle portion of the film, it's a bit more road movie-esque, I would say, because Julie's now traveling with a trucker. So we see them eating together at a cafe of sorts. We see him talking at length. There's a scene in which he kind of coaches her into using her hand to pleasure him, basically. So that's the middle portion of the film. And then the final third of the film involves Julie and a girlfriend, and it includes a very lengthy sex scene, which I believe is 12 minutes long. It's three extended shots of about 4 minutes each. So definitely not a film for the prudish viewer out there. But I enjoyed this film, and I could imagine someone almost warming up for Jeanne Dielman by watching Je tu il elle. I actually had this conversation with a friend the other day because I mentioned that we were doing this podcast, and they'd heard of Akerman and they had seen that there was an Akerman box set from the BFI, and they were saying, should I? They'd heard about Jeanne Dielman, and they were sort of saying, is it a good place to start, or is it too challenging to start with? And I think with the earlier film, with Je tu il elle, you have some similarities because it also kind of doesn't have the most conventional use of film grammar. So it has a lack of close-ups and so on in a similar sort of way to Jeanne Dielman. You also have extended periods of waiting for something to happen, especially in the first third of the film. You also have a focus on an interior domestic space. Mm-hmm. So there are definitely similarities, but the film is maybe a bit more accessible because it's much shorter. I'd say it's more eventful as a whole, even though it, like we said, Jeanne Dielman has a very eventful murder at the end of it. But I think it's definitely a less challenging watch than Jeanne Dielman. So it's hard to put Jeanne Dielman on a double bill with anything because of how long it is. But I think you could maybe tackle both of these films over the course of a weekend or something.
Oh yeah.
But you've seen this film as well, Raquel. I don't know. Would you pair them up perhaps or not?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because they both have 3 parts in terms of like Jeanne Dielman being 3 different days, and then this one being 3 distinct different stories. And even though you have those like really long shots, like the shots of her eating sugar or then spilling the sugar and then scooping it back up into the bag, they last a long time. But it breaks up very nicely because you have 3 distinct stories, even though it's all about this one character. Each story is very different too, so I think it breaks up very nice, and I think, like you said, it's very approachable. And I have to say, I'm really fascinated by how Chantal Akerman shows food. This one with the sugar eating, it's almost a little violent, like why is she eating that much sugar? And then also at the end there's this whole motherly like almost like mother-daughter scene, even though it's the 2 lovers, whereas like the girlfriend is making Nutella and butter sandwiches for Chantal's character, and she's like, encore, more. She makes more. And obviously in Jeanne Dielman there's a lot of food. The ground beef scene always throws me off. In La Chambre, Chantal Akerman's chowing down on an apple. I just think it's really interesting how it almost, because like this regular thing. Oh, and in Sainte-Maville, there's like, she eats spaghetti in a way I've never seen anybody do before. But I think that goes to say a lot about Akerman's work and how she can take these everyday things and kind of show them in this sort of chaotic way.
Yeah, and in Je tu il elle in particular, so she herself is unafraid to be seen as, like you say, very messy with the sugar. And there's something very daring as well, because not only does she take her clothes off, she's very naked for a long time in the film, like I said. So something very interesting about that.
It's very intimate with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone checks out this film or any of the films Raquel mentioned as a result of these recommendations, do let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And I think at this point we're about to say our goodbyes, but before we do, we should quickly preview our next episode. Like we said, we've both selected several films for this season of the podcast, and the next one is my pick, but I traditionally let Raquel reveal the name of the movie to our viewers and listeners. So Raquel, what film are we going to talk about on the next episode of the show?
We're talking about Vertigo, which is in the number 2 spot.
Yeah, number 2 on that 2022 list, and of course a previous number 1. So I felt like we kind of had to tackle it. Really looking forward to revisiting the film and to talking with you about it, Raquel, in the near future. Okay, so we're going to say goodbye at this point, but as ever, it would be great just to leave you with a quick reminder to rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening. So if you're listening to us on Apple, for example, or Spotify, we would love a 5-star rating and a quick review if you don't mind. And on our YouTube channel as well, we're always looking for new subscribers, aren't we, Raquel? So if somebody stumbled on this video, they should press that button, I think, to subscribe, right?
Yes, or they can smash the subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss an episode.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us for this discussion about Jeanne Dielman. We'll be back very soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
You can find the CineHistorians at cinehistorians.com and on X, Letterboxd, and YouTube at CineHistorians.
If you're interested in supporting the show, please consider leaving us a Ko-fi. You can find our Ko-fi link and all of our other links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and happy viewing.